a Bitcoin standard would end any need to obfuscate the degradation of the currency because there would be no degradation.
Hmm.
So what I learned was that the government isn't actually trying just to like hurt us. That's not their incentive. It's just to hide and obscure the theft through inflation that manifests in the food supply. And if we eliminate that one incentive, every nature sort of reasserts itself. Does that make sense? Like everything else will fall back into place because there would be no marketing campaign. They'd have no need to fund Global Lending University to tell us that eating red meat will kill us. It just doesn't end. It all ends.
So today I have the pleasure of being joined by Matthew Lysiak on the show. Matthew, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. The pleasure is mine.
Awesome. So where I'd love to actually get this podcast started is because I know you have quite an extensive background in journalism in general. But recently, of course, you authored the book Fiat Food. And so where I'd love to kind of get this podcast started, if you will, is to talk a bit about your background in journalism, the effect that that maybe had on your life, and then the inclination to then go ahead and author Fiat Food, if that's not too broad of a question.
No, that's a great question. I'm not a natural Bitcoin person. I'm not a nutritional expert. I am an investigative journalist. And my background, I started my own news. I dropped out of high school when I was 17. I started my own newspaper in Pennsylvania. Just me, small town, Laurel, PA, and I was very proud of my work. At a very young age, I built up a pretty big subscriber base, and I tackled some issues that were really important that weren't being covered by the other media in town. But a kid growing up in a small town in journalism, you're in a fishbowl. So I moved to New York City, and I just began kind of scratching and clawing my way up through the New York City journalism world, which wasn't easy because I had zero education. So most of the people I was competing against had gone to Columbia Journalism School or other prestigious institutions, or their parents had somehow been associated with the larger newspapers. But I was rather quickly able to rise from few smaller newspapers through some really big stories like that to get on the radar of the major newspapers until I think maybe 3 years after moving to New York City, I got a job at the New York Daily News. At the time, was the fifth biggest paper in the country, and started out there covering smaller stories. But I quickly rose and became their national reporter, where my job was to cover any breaking news story that happened around the country. So I was the guy who kept taking a backpack in my trunk, and all thing you know, you're with your family eating dinner, and you get the text that there's been a shooting, hit the airport, and flight out. Specifically, my job was to uncover the motive. So when there was a crime, we send other people to cover victims. That didn't really interest me, and I wasn't very good at getting victim narrative. I wanted to get down to the motive of why these things happen, whether it be a mass shooter or government corruption. I love my job, and it was like really a dream come true. And I worked there for several years, but there was a point, I'm married and I have kids, and my wife was just like, I didn't really sign up for this. You're gone, you're traveling. This doesn't work for me. So I transitioned to book writing, and my first book was The Mass Shooting at Sandy Hook, which was published through Simon & Schuster. And fortunately, I moved out of New York City, went the rural route. The book publishing was good. I was what was considered a conventional journalist. I appeared on Good Morning America and Fox News and MSNBC and CNN. I was all over the media doing that thing and publishing with all the books from major publishing houses of Simon & Schuster and HarperCollins and Scholastic. I even have a TV show about my family that's been made. It's on Apple TV. I'm played by Jim Sturgis.
Cool.
My character. It's very interesting. There's 2 seasons of it.
Yeah.
So that, I was part of this mainstream, but when COVID hit, I kind of, like a lot of your listeners, and sort of went through a bit of a change. A lot of these institutions that I've grown up accepting just as an axiom, that they were not perfect, but not like completely disingenuous. My trust in these institutions began to erode. It appeared that they were lying to us over and over again. Weren't even pretending to kind of go through the motions of wanting to tell us the truth. It seemed very scary, and it sent me down a bit of a rabbit hole of information. I've always liked economics. I've always, I've always uh, had a side interest in economics. So that led me to Safety in a Moon, who wrote the Big Standard, and I consider Safe to be one of the top 5 economic minds in the world. And I don't think that's hyperbole. I read the Bitcoin Standard, and I started understanding Bitcoin, where at first I just thought, oh, this is kind of a scam. I didn't see it early. I didn't for what it was. I was a gold bug. I thought, I'm Austrian in economics, and I thought gold is the way to go. And I always understood that the fiat currency was the same, like transparent, this magic money printer attached to nothing, the government can just turn it out.
Yeah.
But I got converted to Bitcoin from Safe's work, and then he wrote his second book called Principles of Economics, or no, I'm sorry, the Fiat Standard. I that really affected me. But in it, he had this short chapter, I believe it's chapter 8, where he just talked about this conspiracy in the food system as a result of these growing forces that sort of came together. And I read this, and I'm like, man, I respect the shit out of Faith as an economist, but he's not an investigative journalist. Like, what is this? And fact-checking is separate. And it blew me away. Not only was Faith right, but he had severely understated the case. However, I understood that despite having worked for every major publishing house, I couldn't even take this idea to engage. But fortunately, I, through my other work, have been, fortunate enough to not really be that concerned with the income of the book. I just wanted to put it out there. I have 4 daughters, and when you have kids, you get to a point where you just want to do something and support them. Like, obviously, I want to make money, but I'm pretty good on money right now, and I didn't feel that need to have to come up with something commercial. So I reached out to David Dean, and I said, I didn't know him. I introduced myself, let him know who I was, and I told him I wanted to write this book, and that he should start his own publishing house, and I'll be his first author. I didn't know this, but he had already been considering starting a publishing house, so he agreed right away. And Fiat Food came out a few months, about a year later, actually, with a lot of work. And it's, of all the work I've done, I've sold screenplays to major studios, and I've published with all the publishing houses, and I've had written and produced 9 different plays. There's nothing I'm more proud of than Fiat Food. Like I'm actually absolutely blown away that it's become as popular as it has. I just didn't expect anybody outside of a very small niche to find this topic interesting. The economics and food. It's being translated right now in, I think, 7 different languages around the world. Bulgaria is the most recent one who wanted to write. So I'm humbled and kind of just shocked at how well it's.
Yeah, no, and that's a fascinating story, and I think there's a lot to unpack there. And what really stood out to me also is, well, I think first, I think also with the Fiat Food, I think because I mean, Safety obviously is famous for the Bitcoin Standard and his work around economics and all his literature there. But I think the beautiful thing I think about Bitcoin, and probably why your book also became so popular, is like Bitcoin. It's not just about it's a whole philosophy, right? It's not just about the asset and the underlying value of the asset, but once you start to really understand Bitcoin, you start to question a lot of different areas of life and really understand, the fundamental underlying principles of how some of the things that we oftentimes don't even question work. Because that's like, I think, kind of the mindset that you start to instill a bit is once you start to understand, okay, what is Bitcoin? How does fiat work? Okay, but where are the incentives? And you keep kind of, scratching down and going down this proverbial rabbit hole. And what was interesting also about your story is, of course, you've been in journalism for a while, and you said that COVID was quite a turning point for you, and I think for a lot of people, especially as it relates to maybe governments and authority and things like that. And so before we kind of get in more into the Fiat Food part of things, I'd love if you could maybe unpack that a little bit more, about that time period and what were maybe some of the things that you started to notice either through your work or just through life in general that made you start to go down that rabbit hole a bit more, if you will.
I think I accepted a premise that the government, I've interviewed former presidents and senators and governors, and I've come to terms with the fact that these people lie. But they generally lie in a way that is geared toward their best interest. And what kind of shocked me about COVID was that it was sort of illogical and rational, a lot of the way they were behaving. And it wasn't even in their best interest. It seemed like there was something more heinous that I couldn't place my finger on, which violated all my precepts of understanding human nature, which was that people act in their own best interest. They were. And, you have these people like Fauci or these health experts, like taking to the airwaves, telling blatant falsehoods. And I think what scared me most, though, as a journalist, was that there was you had that on one side, and then on the other side, you had the censorship debate. And my whole livelihood, Stephen, comes from the ability to express my thoughts and feelings uninhibited. Like, as a journalist, everything that I have is based around that. And what I saw happening very sadly to me was that journalists who should feel the way I did instead became tools of authority to not only censor dissenting views, but to also amplify falsehoods uncritically. And I lost a lot of friends because of this. I've become a heretic in my industry, where before I used to be, very mainstream journalist, appearing on all the things, talking about whatever books I was writing. I was always invited. Now I found myself like an outcast, and I'm glad I'm an out. I mean, I wish I wasn't an outcast, but I'm glad and appreciative of the position I've taken, because at the end of the day, I'm 47 years old. What am I pretending for? Like get another hit on MSNBC. It's 10 o'clock hour, which nobody watches. What exactly am I trying to do? One of the beauties, one of the silver linings that came out of COVID for me was also that this breakdown in trust that I felt was felt by so many other people. And it led to the decentralization of information through a podcast like this, where one of my big concerns in writing this book initially was I'm used to writing with like Simon and Schuster, and they have a press person. They just put me on all these shows. How am I going to get the word out? And also, that model would be broken for me. How could I get the word out sitting on a chair after getting my makeup done and for it's absurd, getting there for like 80 minutes, and I'm in a green room, and then there's bagels, and then suddenly I'm out there and I have 4 minutes to discuss a topic that's complicated as 6 months. The podcast, it's made for topics like this because you've got to really get into it in depth. There's a lot happening, so I'm just appreciative on that end and how we came out the other side.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with you fully. I think for me, COVID was also quite a big paradigm shift of, trusting more mainstream news and mainstream outlets. And I mean, obviously through technologies like the internet and through forums like Twitter and podcasts and other ways where people are able to exercise free speech, and also allow people to absorb and distill information on their own. I think that's been a very powerful force towards people really understanding more how things fundamentally work. And from your experience, because I think what's really interesting is you were able to experience both sides of the coin. You're able to experience, the time working in mainstream media where it was reputable, where it was trustworthy, to kind of seeing it switch a bit. So why do you think that happened? What changed to kind of cause for this lack of trust in mainstream media, and also for mainstream media to maybe abuse the trust that they did have with the people?
Well, the people stopped trusting the media because the media stopped telling the truth, and they deserve it. These are dinosaurs, and they're all going extinct like the good women. Why the media shifted, I think, is a little more complicated. I think there's a lot of factors. I think one of them is that, it's interesting because I'll give you an example, Scale. Working on the case of Sandy Hook, I did a lot of research on the family of the shooter, and one of the things that blew the minds of my editors was that the mother was from New Hampshire, and she had a bunch of guns, and they kept trying to portray her as a gun. And I kept trying to explain, no. I come from rural Pennsylvania. 6 guns is probably less than the normal person that I grew up with. And they weren't gun nuts. They were hunters, and they lived rural, and they would hunt for their food sometimes, and nothing that they could not comprehend that. It just didn't make sense to them. And there's a lot of issues that came across where they didn't look at themselves by it, but they couldn't look outside of their own world. They couldn't see that people thought differently. So everything was through the lens. And I think that over the past 6 years, that just became more reinforced because of the takeover of education. I think I never went to college full time. I never graduated high school, but I took one class because my dad's a professor at a university, so I got free tuition. I took one class on journalism, and I remember thinking I had to drop out of the class because I was getting dumber by the minute. It really wasn't about journalism. It was more advocacy of some sort of social justice. I'm old school. I want to know who, what, where, why, when, how, wherever that goes. That's how that's my journalistic ethos. And so I think it's multifaceted. And then you also have the fact that a lot of these industries now rely either on government grants in media or pharmaceutical advertising. So it's a lot of media now is just theater. It's I used to work with Don Lemire, friend. He's a good guy. I was friends, smart. Worked with New York Daily News, and now he's on MSNBC Morning Joe, just spouting propaganda for authority. And he wasn't like that. But the incentive structure for a journalist to rise kind of stole its soul. And now got where he wanted to go. He's the mainstream guy. But he's just sort of covering for authority and doing it in an authoritative voice. And it actually really saddens me. I think there's a lot of people who see that if you want to rise in journalism today, the quickest way is to echo authority. Which, once you can master that, you have a nice suit, and then suddenly you get to wake up at 6 a.m. and spout government mantras.
Yeah. It's very sad that it's gone that way, and I think that's why we're also seeing this fundamental shift. I think even in the last election cycle that we just had, we see things like the Joe Rogan podcast, the impact that had on the overall vote, and its ability to fundamentally inform and shift people, or just inform people better in a way that is just so different from what we're used to. And I think for the better, people are able to obtain news without it being filtered through some type of filter, essentially. And what I like, of course, about your approach is that the fundamental aspect, like you were saying, towards journalists, towards finding the truth, no matter if the result is not what people want to hear, and really uncovering, what is the what, why, where, when. And so when you read that chapter in the Fiat Standard from Saifedean, is food something that you had, before reading that chapter, is that something that you had thought about in a way where you did kind of look at these incentive systems of how government may play a role in our overall diet and food subsidies and things like that? Or was that something that was pretty new to you at the time when you were reading that chapter?
I consider myself a very cynical person who looks at things from a critical lens, and I'm embarrassed to say no. Stephen, like, I just assumed that these people were telling the truth. Why would they lie about nutrition? That's insane. Like, who would lie about that? That's crazy thought. So no, I had no idea. But I was somebody who grew up in the 90s under the dietary food pyramid, and some of your audience might remember this. This was when the government came out in 1992. So they came up with the first real dietary guidance in 1980, which told us to replace saturated fat found in meat with more protein. But in 1952, they gave us exact portions, and they told us the average American should eat between 8 to 11 portions of grains a day, which is simply a recipe for medical disgusting. And it wasn't just some government bureaucrat saying stupid shit. This became the law of the land. So I grew up in a public school system in rural Pennsylvania where this doctrine became institutionalized as part of my daily eating. So you see the whole milk get replaced by fat-free milk, which nobody drank because it tasted like ass. So they had to infuse it with sugar or strawberry, which gave it just as much sugar essentially as a Coca-Cola. All the animal fats that our ancestors ate got replaced by some kind of low-fat, non-food version of it. I came out of high school not only metabolically compromised, but addicted to a lot of really bad foods. Like, when you reduce the fat in food, you have to generally replace it with sugar because the fat's what gives things to taste. So I came out of high school and I had something called osteogenic sarcoma. So I had cancer. And I had to miss about 2 years of my teens, hospitalized. And I remember thinking, I was overweight. I remember thinking and asking my doctor, what did I do to get this? Like, why am I sick? And he was like, well, nobody knows. It wasn't your fault, though. Probably genetics or something. Well, I think I intuitively understood that I'd been eating horribly long. Like, I ate tons of the seed oils that they were pushing and other big foods that the government was endorsing. So I did come out of my teen years always trying to think like, man, I don't want to get sick again. That was awful. But I just didn't make the connection that maybe the government was lying. Like, I guess that just sounded absurd. So it took that nudge from Saifedean kind of point me into that direction. And then I was off to the races and become obsessed. I changed my life dramatically.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and yeah, again, going from the preposition that, like, because essentially that's how I think initially I was raised as well, the trust and authority, and that they were steering you in the right direction. And I think, over the past few years, obviously, it's also been a big revelation to me that they're not always acting in your best interest. And so when you started going down this. Started researching for Fiat Food and really going down this rabbit hole, what were some of maybe first for my listeners who haven't gotten the opportunity to read the book, if you want to maybe just summarize like the overall thesis of Fiat Food, and then maybe what were some of the bigger revelations that you started to uncover as you started to do the research for the book?
Something happened about 55 years ago that completely altered and corrupted the entire food supply. And Fiat Food is an examination from an investigative journalist standpoint with over 200 citations. It's exactly that. And I trace it back to the early 1900s. And there was a group called the Seventh-day Adventists, run by somebody named Ellen G. White. This is a young woman who got hit in the head with a rock. She's walking in school one day. She's a young girl, wakes up out of this coma, and says she is getting a message from God. God is telling the young man, I'm coming back soon. And you need to have everybody's body your money. And the way to do that is to try to eliminate these very evil carnal desires in young men and women. And these carnal desires are caused by meat consumption. In the early 1900s, people were eating meat for breakfast and dinner if they could afford it. So she begins the Seventh-day Adventist search, and it's a real push towards trying to switch people's diets from meat to plant-based. She hires somebody named John Harvey Kellogg, like a young man, and tasks him with trying to find what is essentially an anti-macrobial drug to substitute out meat for people's breakfast. He discovers and invents Kellogg's cornflakes. And to give your audience a little background on John Harvey, he was just a real masochist. He was celebrity doctor of the day, went around writing books and giving speeches. And unfortunately for myself, I read almost all of them. He advocated having surgery on young men to prevent masturbation without anesthesia so that they'd have muscle memory, cages, and pouring carbolic acid on the clitorises of young females. Real sick. But he sincerely believes this stuff, right? You could tell from his writings he was a huge advocate of this connection. And I know this sounds wild, but in the beginning of the 1900s, this was a really widely held belief that almost all disease came from carnal desires and masturbation. That almost everything from cancers to acne were the result of carnal desires caused by meat. So still, 1970 comes around, and well, to backtrack for 1 second, John Harvey Kellogg was then replaced by somebody named Lana Cooper, who began the American Dietetic Association, which in time would become the government's formalized nutrition department. So still, by 1970, people are still eating meat though for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. This other fog we had in the early 1900s was a push by corporations to get us to eat cheaper plant-based food, because for as long as anybody can remember, everybody ate meat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner when they could find it. The whole diet was built around meat, but it just wasn't as profitable. So there was an attempt, in particular, one of the things that I highlight in my book was Procter and Gamble, who had used cottonseed waste to fund as a lubricant through the Industrial Revolution. And when that was over, they had all this cottonseed waste and didn't know what to do with it. I mean, they didn't really have a market for it. So they decided to try to figure out a way to get people to eat it. And they messed around with it a bunch. And when they initially put it out, people were disgusted. They rightfully didn't recognize this part of the food market. But when World War II happened, same thing with margarine. Margarine originally was called oleomargarine, and there were riots in New York City over people substituting it with butter because it was cheaper and not telling consumers. And people were disgusted by this. It was trash. And people identified it as so. But when World War II came and there was a real desire to lower food prices, these two things made more inroads. Also very sophisticated marketing, highlighting that lard and these other cooking techniques that our ancestors had used to do it, tallow, were backwards. And the new way to do it was through Crisco. Or used to have margarine, and these were futuristic housewives. But despite these pushes, 1970 comes around, People are still eating meat for breakfast and lunch and dinner. What happens in 1971, on August 15th, is that Richard Nixon decouples from the state. So before August 15th, 1971, the American people were no longer allowed to redeem their promissory notes for gold, but foreign banks could. This put up a real restraint on the government's ability to just print paper. Nixon's not a good guy in my book, but one of the things that I realized when I really dug into the data was that he had kind of an impossible situation because of the Lyndon Johnson New Deal, which defeated him, and the Vietnam War. We had printed out far more promissory notes than we had gold in our reserves. So all it would have taken were a few countries at the same time to try to redeem their promissory notes to reveal that America was committing a heinous fraud. We just didn't have the gold. So Nixon gives a speech on August 15th, 1971, where he decoupled. He tells all of the world that these notes that were promises of gold will no longer be honored. The gold is ours. We're essentially speaking. One of the things that really struck out to me when I went through a lot of the documents I obtained from the Nixon administration was that they were very understanding of the fact that people will tolerate corruption, they tolerate wars, but when food prices go too high, it's a heavy association with government instability. And you see this in the American University, I think, in 2022 chronicled 12,500 food and energy related riots in Europe alone in just that year, based on largely on high food prices. We saw in Sri Lanka that same year, people stormed the palace, and high prices were a huge reason why. So there's a connection, and Nixon understood that because the new dollars were going to be printed, there was a high concern. Of course, food prices were going to go. The first thing he does is he appoints a guy named, what's his name? To Department of Agriculture head. His first name's horrible. I apologize. I can't remember the name off the top of his head. And tasks him with consolidating the American food system. So pre-1971, we had a lot of small independent farmers dotting the country. He, through a series of grants and giving loans to larger industry, consolidated it, farmland, and wanted basically to substitute meat, which was higher in cost, with grain. And he was largely successful in accomplishing it. And what we saw in 1971 was this transformation of our food supply so that it's an appearance that food is abundant, when in reality, the nutrients that we've subsisted on as humans for generations have become cost prohibitive. As an example, I have 4 daughters, as I mentioned. I could successfully feed them very cheaply with 5 boxes of cereal in a day, right? That's cheap. But if we're talking about the nutrients, like steak, egg, cheese, the costs are becoming cost prohibitive. So right now in America, nutrients are only able to be obtained by the upper classes, while we're the lower classes, like peasants from the 14th century, endless groups of grains. And you saw, beginning in 1971, the entire incentive structure built based on fiat switched. So, for instance, the church became weaponized by the fiat money printer, where pre-1970, they were talking about these issues, but were not able to capture the heart of the nation who still ate the food their ancestors ate. From 2015 to 2018, I believe they received $155 million in government grants, fiat dollars, to fund studies out of a university called Oberlin University in California, which they run. Seventh-day Adventist Churches runs. You look at the board of directors and call them. They're tasked with coming up with studies. The studies never are scientific. They are always observational studies. Just not to get in the weeds on, can't establish causal relationship. It's like me saying, I just took a study of 10 people who had cancer and 9 of them drank milk. So there's an association then between milk and cancer, and you just have the headline. So they're coming up with almost all these studies that say meat is bad. and meat causes X problem. And they're all observational studies. The majority of them come from this church, funded by these fiat dollars, which began in 1971. And then you also have other studies like the Tufts Food Compass, which are funded by industry, which finds it just far more profitable to sell us these disgusting plant-based products. For example, in January 2023, the Tufts Food Compass came. And I think about these people a lot because they spend their entire life worshiping nutrition and studying. And their conclusion is that Fruit Loops was healthier than red meat and eggs, and that almond flavored soy milk was healthier than whole milk. It's absurd. It's lunacy. But when you see who funds the study, it is funded by the same General Mills and Kellogg's who have 55 cereals on the preferred to eat list. And then you see that same month, 60 Minutes came out with a segment that had Dr. Fatima Stanford talk about the fact that people are no longer in control of their health, that obesity is actually a genetic brain disease, and that what you eat doesn't matter. It's a genetic brain disease, and the only cure is Ozempic or these Wegovy, right? It didn't really mention that she was a paid consultant for Novo Nordisk, the parent company, and that the actually entire segment was sponsored by Novo Nordisk, or that the only other person on this who was consulted in the segment was Dr. Carolyn Apropi, who was also a paid consultant for Novo Nordisk. Same month, January 2023, the American Pediatric Association comes out for the first time in 15 years and says that the standard of care for children now needs to involve, who are obese, these lifetime weight loss drugs. So, I couldn't find a smoking gun that showed they had all colluded in this campaign, but obviously it wasn't just a coincidence. And I kind of wanted to bring that example up because it shows like everything has become corrupted. And it happened when the incentive shifted, because at the heart of government and then is the need to obfuscate the monetary degradation caused by the inflation of the dollar. So if you're eating nothing but cereal, or Doritos, you don't actually even notice inflation. Like, you really don't. And why I propose, I used to think gold, but I've become a little more skeptical of gold now. Bitcoin, if you own your private keys, how this shifts that is because it ends the Federal Reserve's, a Bitcoin standard would end any need to obfuscate the degradation of the currency, because there would be no degradation.
Mm-hmm.
So what I learned was that the government isn't actually trying just to hurt us. That's not their intent. It's just to hide and obscure the theft through inflation that manifests in the food supply. And if we eliminate that one incentive, every nature sort of reasserts itself. Does that make sense? Everything else will fall back into place, because there would be no marketing campaign. They'd have no need to fund Global Lending University to tell us that eating red meat will kill us. It just ends. It all ends.
Yeah. It's a super fascinating topic, and I think there's so many different directions that we could go in, because I think a large part of it is indeed, like you said, it's the government's need to perceptually diminish the effects of inflation. And like you said, if people are just eating Doritos and cereals, they may not notice it as much, versus if they're trying to buy things like steak or even milk, or we had the whole thing around eggs and eggs getting absurdly expensive. I wonder also, how do you see corporate greed playing into this? Because I think that's also a big I'd like to hear your opinion about it, because I think I agree also it's the money that's a big problem. But obviously also for companies like Kellogg's, it's very convenient that they can market their products as being healthy, because it allows them to sell more. And so because I think sometimes when you try to explain it to people, because people are so used to mainstream media and marketing and believe the things that are taught, which naturally you would assume you do. How do you how do you see those things interplaying? I don't know if my question is making a lot of sense because I'm trying to unpack a few things here, but how do you also see the effect of corporate greed and how that maybe corporate greed isn't the right word, but how do you see that also having an effect on the overall food supply and how we currently eat?
So, Stephen, like you've touched on something that actually has been just really pissing me off lately, which is this, that we're in this place right now where people are starting to see the degradation of our food system. Ask legitimate questions. We have Kennedy up there, and you have like the Kelly and Casey Means people running around talking about the degradation of the food supply. And in describing the symptom, they're completely right. Like they're a gift in the sense that like they're describing the problem as it manifests in symptoms really well. But what's pissing me off a bit is that we have this opportunity where we're open in this discussion and we're ignoring the source. We're ignoring what the core problem is. We're on these Ferris wheels throwing snowballs at each other, just blaming.
Mm.
And look, the corporations are not the good guys. But just to remind everybody that pre 1970, corporations' incentive of greed was the same. It didn't just magically pop up in 1971. Corporations didn't just all of a sudden become greedy in 1970. Of course not. Well, what happened? The American health system was so much better. People were so much healthier in 1970. Yet all the incentive for corporate greed existed equally strong. What shifted in 1971? The degradation of our currency and the need to obfuscate the inflationary theft of its citizens led to a mass gaslighting campaign to convince us that the foods we've been eating for generations was actually a fact, even though we were eating for thousands of years. That is at the core of the problem. And until we can understand that, and until we can get that message out, we're all just sitting there looking at the patient on the table, just describing how awful it is that he's 300 pounds and that he died of emphysema and diabetes. And we're eliminating any discussions about what really was at the source of his malady. And so, I mean, I apologize for my own. I know I get kind of fired up about it, but like you have these means people and others like them who are just kind of dominating the airwaves right now. And it's just red meat. Like it's short sighted. And it's frankly, a lot of this conversation is shallow and it doesn't get to the true cause. So, yeah, it pisses me off a little bit.
No, but
I'm glad you have that because this is really, really important. People need to understand it.
I understand, yeah, and that's also why I asked the question, because I think that's also something that I see a lot. Is it's not really going down to the root cause of things, and it's more, I have friends who I lived in California for a while, and California used to be a place a while ago that was more spirited towards innovation and a mindset that I think embodied things like Silicon Valley and things like that. And now I noticed, and also part of the reason I moved away is because it's almost gone the opposite. People don't question things, and people are very quick to just point fingers and, oh, it's corporate greed, and, oh, it's this and it's that. And as you said, it's not a very productive conversation and not really going to the root cause of things. And your answer was perfect in the sense that you highlighted it great, where corporate greed has been something that's, and naturally, right, companies are incentivized to make a profit. But what fundamentally changed, as you mentioned, is in 1970, when Nixon went off the gold standard, our currency fundamentally changed. And so how can people, given the information that we've talked about, and also maybe when you were going down, when you were investigating things, like how can people fundamentally combat this? How can they fix their health, fix their lives, fix their diets? Like, what were some practical steps that you think people can take to understand the problem more and then take steps to fix it?
I suggest the first thing people do is to opt out of the modern mainstream information landscape. It's a psyop, and you're being propaganda.
like opt out of that. You don't need to turn on MSNBC or Fox News. Like you actually just don't need to watch. Like you don't need.
Mm.
And that will start curing your body, curing your mind in a sense. Because there's a quote Ronald Reagan had that I always think about, which is that he said, and I'm not going to get this exactly right, but it isn't that his liberal friends were dumb. It's just that they know so many things that aren't true. And this would apply to me personally. It wasn't that I didn't have enough information. In fact, the opposite. I had so much information that wasn't true that I'd accepted these actions. So the first thing I would encourage your audience to do is to opt out of these mainstream news outlets and websites, newspapers. And then the second thing is, look, you don't need to buy my book to figure out what to do, right? Wolves don't have to read books to figure out what they're doing. They just know. Like, you don't need to listen to this podcast. Like, look what your great grandmother would do. She was actually pretty onto it. I eat almost nothing but meat. Full disclosure, I can't get off coffee. Tried a little bit ago. My productivity took a nosedive, but I drink, like, I run every day. I haven't missed a day of running in over 10 years now, and I play a lot of basketball with people much younger and in better shape than me, taller than me, and I feel great. Like, I basically opted out of all the Fiat foods. So I have a farmer I live in Arizona. Like, I get steaks. I'm fortunate enough to be able to afford these. I eat like a ribeye every morning. And then I might have some burger patties in the afternoon. One of the things that happened to me, though, is my weight gets shot down. And I was getting tossed around on my basketball court out there. Like, so I began incorporating raw milk. I drink a lot of raw milk. I drink about a half quart of raw milk every day to keep my weight up. It also keeps my cravings for sugar away. Keeps a little sugar in raw milk and keeps me out of ketosis, which I know some people like. But I would encourage everybody to cleanse your mind by opting out of the narratives they're pushing on us through mainstream media. And I, as somebody who is in that, can tell you it's garbage for your mind. And then start your day out with red meat. Like, if you can start it out with red meat, then the cravings that you're going to have are going to be diminished, because the cravings are generally like, where in the past fat people, overweight people were a sign of affluence, today it's a sign of nutritional depravity, because you're constantly grazing. Your body's constantly searching for those nutrients. So you're just, you're eating all day. Those two things will change your life. And you don't need to, like, again, buy my book, but I would just give it 30 days and see what your body tells you. Like, if you could just eat animal-based products for 30 days and just listen, you'll feel like a superhero. Your mind will be better. All these different things will fall into place. Listen to your body and you'll be shocked.
Yeah. I've seen a lot of examples, yourself included, of people who have done super well on it. And I think it is something that I think a lot of people could benefit of. And I think, like you said, trying it for yourself and experimenting for yourself as well, because I think everybody responds differently, of course. But for most people, well, for myself, it's something that, to be honest, is something that I'm trying to do more and more. I mean, I think I stay away from as much processed food as I can. For me, I try to center my diet mainly around animal products. I don't know if you're familiar at all with, like, Paul Sell, and his philosophy, like the more, well, animal-based essentially, but incorporating a bit of fruits and things like that. But I think those things along those lines can be very beneficial to a lot of people, especially once you start to opt out of, like you said, the Fiat foods and the processed foods and move towards more animal-based and foods like you said. And what were some of the, out of curiosity also, what were some of the biggest changes you noticed when you did start to eat that way?
You eat like shit for lunch. I'm Italian, so I'd have, like, some pizza, and then I need to rest for an hour. Like, I would need to lay down for an hour. I don't need that. I think the biggest thing is I feel very level, and I have 4 daughters. I think
and like they're intense. Like from teenagers, man, like it's really intense. So I'm able to feel emotionally level. I've
Mm-hmm.
never been like a temper guy, but I'm like now I'm zen. I can deal with them better. And one of the more notable things tangibly is I'm working on my next book right now. And like I have my notes written down. I transcribe them in my computer. And I can remember probably maybe 75% more words when I just move them over. Like my mind is, and it's not, and it's funny because I think about what the hell, like, why is my mind so much sharper right now? And it's because it's not, I don't know how much it is actually the meat or the fact that I'm just not eating toxins. Like, shocker, my mind's working better when I'm not filling it with like cinnamon toast crunch cereal bars. Like the toxins that weigh you down and make you think like an idiot.
Yeah.
So I think those are probably on the court physically when I ball or my running time. They definitely improve. One of the things I notice is that I never get injured, knock on wood. But I think it's because I don't have inflammation. So while everybody is, these 20-year-olds I'm playing with are constantly getting twisted ankles and shit. I don't get that. Like I just, and I can go along with them. And generally, they're usually the ones who I never am like tapping out good, like you run until somebody taps out. So the cardio is definitely really good. And I credited a lot of this to the transition away from the, especially now that I'm like 47. So, I think what I could have done at 25 is just different now to keep the same energy level I've needed to just be more vigilant on what I consume and how my body will react to it.
Yeah, super interesting. And yeah, I think you're inspiring me also more to try to shift more towards animal based. I think for me, I'm actually also well at the moment I'm training for a full Ironman coming up in June, and so thank you. Yeah, so I think the part that I'm trying to figure out is more the carb part, because I think you can. I'm actually curious out of your experience, because I know obviously in the endurance world, carbs are a big thing, right? How do you feel like? I guess you're getting some carbs from the raw milk, but how do you typically like when you're running or playing basketball? Do you feel sustained energy wise to support those efforts?
Honestly, no. I used to not, and it vexed me because so what would happen is I would play basketball, and then like we usually run for about 3.5 hours straight. Winners stay on 3 on 3. And what would happen is there would be a point in the night where you dive into like that extra energy level to boost, and I didn't have it. Like I was like, oh, like I'm eating so clean. Why don't I have this? I can't pull in. And I reached out to some athletes who are practice carnivory, and they emphasize electrolytes. So I began to add more electrolytes, but still like come hour 1.5 when usually I could like dive into that adrenaline. I just couldn't dive in. And the raw milk, which has carbs, I know people will like dismiss this, but just for me, I noticed like this direct bam, like all of a sudden it's fat. Like, okay, so I would drink actually extra raw milk on those days. I would ball, which is always Saturday evening. So, and I would always have it then. I'm like, all right, this is good. I'm not putting all these toxins in me. And so look, carnivory is not a religion. Like the main thing is to stop eating shit. Like stop putting that stuff in your body, and for people to be like good to themselves and not go through all these mental items. Because if you can just like, I think I go hardcore carnivory usually the first 100 days of the year, because to detox my system of anything that might be in there, and then I generally loosen up. This year I included the raw milk. Last year I went the first 100 days without any raw milk, and
so just red meat.
Yeah, and my wife was like, you look like a Holocaust survivor. Like you're too thin, and it just wasn't working for me. So I think there is a little flexibility, but
this idea that like you need to have a balanced diet, that's just marketing. Like you don't need a balanced diet. You don't need a balance between um a Kellogg's, cornflakes and Fruit Loops. You don't need a balance of that. And no, but maybe there is a place for some people, for some periods of their time, for some raw honey, for some raw milk, for some organic fruits and vegetables. Maybe there is a place. So,
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I just know what works. What works for me.
Yeah, no, definitely, and that's also what kind of why I said a bit. It's super personal, I know that there's a bunch of people who really thrive off of carnivore. I believe Safedine is also carnivore, and there's people who like Paul Saladino, for example, who incorporate some fruits, some organs, some other types of nutrients. But I think the main premises that I see in a lot of these people who are really thriving off of whether it's carnivore or it's animal based is that 99% of it is just avoiding all the bad stuff, avoiding all of the processed stuff, avoiding all of the seed oils and avoiding all of that. And I think once you accomplish that, you're already like 99% of the way there, right? So yeah, it's interesting to talk about that, and I think especially as it relates to diet, I could ask you a lot more questions, but I know we're close to running out of time here. So I'd love to open it up for you. You also mentioned that you're working on a new book. Is it also in regards to this topic? Is it something totally different?
It's in regard to this topic. It's connected. And it's about the corruption of medicine. It's very tied into the corruption of food. It's very interlinked, but I think just a wire brushed home to this, and it's different in many ways, but I mean it's dark. It's a dark book. I should be done this in the middle.
Okay.
And, I'm going to be publishing through the Safe House with Safety. And it's a bit shocking. I hope you have me on. I would love to explain it to you after I get a copy in my hands.
Yeah, I'd love to read it as well. And I think, I think the main premise here also, like with Fiat Food, with Bitcoin Standard, there's a lot of uncomfortable truths. And I think also, especially when you're recounting stories like the story of Kellogg and all of the Seventh Adventist Church and all that, it's like it almost seems like a story, like a movie. But these are factual things that are based in reality, and they are uncomfortable truths, and they are not fun to discover. But it takes people like you to really do the investigative journalism to uncover those truths for us. I think to be able to move forward as a society, to be healthier, to be happier, to be able to. That's why also Bitcoin is so important, to be able to save in a money that's away and out of the hands of any government control. And so I'm very appreciative of the work that you're doing, and I'm excited to read your upcoming book as well. Does it have a title yet, or are you still working on that?
Fiat Medicine.
Fiat Medicine. Nice and simple, keeping it in theme. Awesome. Well, Matthew, thank you so much for taking the time to come on. Again, I really appreciate your time, and I know we didn't get the chance to delve much into Bitcoin, but I think because this is such a important topic as well, and a lot of my other episodes are mainly Bitcoin focused, I really wanted to emphasize this. But of course, I think if my readers are interested, they can dive more into your book to understand how diet factors into, or the whole fiat food system, and how that really has an impact on our lives, and also books like Fiat Standard by Safedine and Bitcoin Standard. So I'll put all those in the link, and anything else you want to direct my listeners to here?
I just want to thank you for allowing me to express these heretical views on your airwaves, and keep up the great work, man. I appreciate this platform you built.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, and hopefully chat again soon. Then when you have when Fiat Medicine comes out, I'm excited to read it and continue this conversation.
Looking forward to it. Stay well. Thank you.
Awesome. You as well. Thank you.